Hello, my name is Brendan, and I'm with Tegan Miner. She is a local kindergarten teacher at a private Christian school in the Orlando area. I'll be interviewing her specifically on how COVID-19 has affected her as a teacher. So, Tegan, tell me about your teaching background.
So, as you said, my name is Tegan, and I have been teaching kindergarten in the private sector for the past 6 years. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I have an extensive background in early childhood education. I received my bachelor's of arts in elementary education, and I recently completed my master's in curriculum and instruction.
Okay, so how has teaching in the pandemic affected your enjoyment of being in the education sector?
So, teaching in a private school during this time has been pretty different from what the public schools have been doing. Fortunately, for me and for my students, we haven't had to go virtual at all. We've been in person this entire time. Now, of course, that can definitely have its positives and negatives at the moment, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic where it was more serious and there was more of the unknown. But fortunately, we've been able to stay in person. And I feel like because of that, I've been able to enjoy my job the same way that I always have been able to. I've always been with the students, hands on. Um, of course, working with 5 year olds, I can't imagine having to work in a virtual setting because 5 year olds' attention spans are already really, really low. Think about, 5 to 10 minutes tops with most activities. So I can't imagine what it would be like to be teaching in a virtual setting. But because I'm not in that virtual setting, my enjoyment has pretty much, stayed consistent. I've enjoyed teaching. These past 2 years have been no different in that regard for me and my students.
So, specifically, what protocols has your institution implemented to protect staff and students from COVID 19?
So, this is where I would begin to say that working for a private Christian school in particular has not been the most positive experience. From the very beginning, from March of 2020, we have not implemented many protocols at all. So, masks were never required because it's a church. There was never a time where that was forced, they could always get around the rules. And it seemed like um, throughout the entire school year, they were constantly trying to find ways to get around protocol, to get around safety measures. Now, they would do little things so that in the eyes of the parents and in the eyes of the staff to some regard, it made it look like they were doing things like they would have a clean pen pile and a dirty pen pile, and they would say that they're going back into the back and sanitizing those dirty pens, but in fact they really were not. Our cleaning procedures stayed the same. I really don't know of any true measures that were taken to protect the staff. In fact, none of the staff wore masks at all. And if you were someone who felt like you wanted to wear a mask, you could do that, but it was almost like it was discouraged. And there was almost a stigma around, oh, that teacher has decided to wear a mask. Why is that? Do they, are they afraid? Thinking from their Christian perspective as well, they would think things like, oh, are they a Christian? Do they not trust God? Um, so there was a lot of stigma, and I felt really uncomfortable as someone who works in a Christian school that is not a Christian myself. Um, it was challenging, and I found myself having to choose between, do I not wear a mask and do I risk it? Or do I, make myself look like an outcast and someone who is different than everybody else. And that was a hard call. In most cases, I decided to not wear a mask and to just try to have my students wash hands very, very frequently, for myself to wash hands. But as far as social distancing and all of that kind of stuff, none of that was happening. And there really wasn't a concern for how to keep anybody safe. I recall one time where there was a supposed COVID case with one of the staff members, and it was kept hush hush. Um, n- Nothing was ever really done. No one was made to quarantine. It was just all a really unsafe situation as far as COVID is concerned.
So, just for those who don't know, what is the difference between what your school would do as a private school and what a public school would do?
So, generally speaking, a public school has taken the pandemic pretty seriously, even in states like Florida, um, where the pandemic has overall, the consensus has been, that we have not taken it super seriously. But public schools have definitely taken the measures that that they felt necessary. Sanitation rules have been very strict in the public schools. Social distancing has been enforced, especially in the beginning. I know it's since eased up a bit, but it was really heavily enforced, even to the point of driving the teachers mad in some situations. Also, not only was there social distancing and extra sanitation, but masks were required. They were something that everybody had to wear: students, faculty, staff of any kind. And all those measures were put in place as a safeguard for all of the people who regularly went to the schools, the physical building. Even though we were going to a physical building every day, like I had mentioned, no sanitation, no social distancing, no masks required. And really, they created a space where it was a facade. They made it seem like safety measures were being taken, but in fact, they were not at any angle. In fact, I think because of the lack of work for people not wanting to come into buildings, a lot of our cleaning staff were no longer coming every single week or every single day the way that they were before. So we may have been getting even less sanitation, less of these services than we had pre-pandemic.
Okay, so how has the pandemic affected your class sizes?
Our class sizes were affected specifically in the beginning of the pandemic when parents and teachers really didn't know what this was. We didn't know how long it was going to last. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how long it was going to take for this to go away or us to get a vaccine or a cure. So, in the beginning, especially towards March and April of 2020, my class size depleted. We had parents pulling children out of school left and right. So I started out with a class of 22 at the beginning of 2020. And then by the end of the year, I had less than 10 children in my graduating class. So that's really less than half stayed with us. And we didn't offer a virtual option at that time, and we still don't. But we didn't offer that virtual option. And because of that, a lot of parents were taking their children and homeschooling them for the remainder of the year. So think of less than 10 children in a class. And um, really, I didn't know how many of those children were going to stay. So the remainder of our year, from about, I would say, April to May, we learned, but it wasn't to the same capacity that we would have if the pandemic did not occur. I didn't know how much of anything was sticking. I didn't know how much of any of it was worth it at that time.
So, what effect has there been on communication with parents?
Communication with parents throughout the pandemic has been pretty much the same. I still see a lot of them face to face as I would have pre pandemic. The only difference I would say is my administrators at my school decided that, in light of the pandemic and people not wanting to really meet in person, that we no longer had to have in person parent teacher conferences, that we could do them through Zoom. So all of my parent teacher conferences are now conducted through Zoom instead of in person, and I email them the documents and different things that they would need opposed to handing them to them in person. The main motivation behind this, as far as my administration is concerned, is not necessarily to protect people. As I've mentioned, they don't really care about that, it seems like, but it's more so, oh, we don't have to have our teachers come in early or stay late. And we don't have to make sure that space or that time is available for them anymore. Now they can do it on their lunch breaks or on their free periods when the children are not in their care. So it's taken up a lot of my planning time, my personal time, my lunch time, opposed to having a set time to be able to meet with parents. Parents seem to like it because it fits conveniently in their schedule. They don't have to get up and come meet the teacher. But for me, it really hasn't been a super positive thing. We've already used, apart from parent teacher conferences, virtual communications. I feel like that's been something that all schools and teachers have been using for a while now. We didn't really bring it to the next level or enhance our digital communication, but it's always been a tool that we've used. Like every week, parents will receive updates for their children, pictures if we go on a special field trip or do something out of the ordinary, and basically a rundown of what they're learning, what we're expecting, and if there's any kind of, think of it like a newsletter update. We've always done that kind of thing, and that's continued throughout the pandemic. Our communication has stayed pretty consistent. It's been pretty good overall. I would say that main difference is definitely the Zoom meetings that we have implemented.
So, how has COVID 19 affected your emotional and mental health?
So, like the majority of people, COVID 19 has really changed my life in a lot of ways, at least temporarily. And some of those ways obviously include, things that everyone has to do, like, it's harder to get out. It's harder to, go about my daily life doing, what I would need to do. As far as my classroom, usually I would go out shopping for supplies and different things that I need for my classroom. Lately, for the past year and a half, 2 years, I haven't really been doing that as much. I haven't been buying for my classroom. Maybe that's a positive thing as far as my wallet is concerned. Um, but I just haven't been going out to stores the way that I would have before. And not being able to go out other than mostly to work um, hasn't been great for me. I'm someone who's very sociable. I love to hang out with people, to do things, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic. That was really, really difficult. I felt like I was going to work where regulations weren't upheld at all. And then the rest of the world was living like just in a different state, a different mentality where we didn't gather at all. I remember we were still open even when like all the stores were closed down. I think the only store that was really even open was Walmart or drive-throughs, and Walmart even closed at like something crazy like 8 o'clock in the afternoon or the evening or whatever. And that just wasn't the world that we were living in. Like I had mentioned, we never wore masks. And it was kind of scary. I was worried what I would be exposed to where I work. And if I was exposed to something, The stigma of having to explain that to my employer and tell them, hey, I can't come to work. I didn't know that I could do that safely, and without judgment. I had seen people come into work sick, and they were expected to do that. So, as far as my mental health is concerned, it was a really uncertain time, especially in the first few months. Now, as everything has, you know, loosened and the regulations have lightened up, I would say there's less concern there because we know more of what we're dealing with. However, the majority of the people that I work with, including staff, administration, children, and families, remain unvaccinated. And I remain without being able to wear a mask. So my exposure is constant, even at this point.
Okay, so what resources does your school have to help students who are struggling as a result of family loss or financial instability caused by COVID?
So, fortunately, even for private schools, the government has stepped in and been a huge help financially for families to try to alleviate some of the stress that has come with COVID-19. As far as my school's concerned themselves, they haven't really taken any initiative except for giving the government resources. And some of those include free education or free tuition for a time for students whose families are first responders. So think like police officers, firefighters, people who work in those kind of roles. They've also helped out staff by giving special bonuses. Like I said, most of those are coming from either the state or the government. So those have been made available to pretty much everybody.
Now, how have you been personally financially impacted during the pandemic? Would you say that you are paid enough?
So, one major issue with the pandemic is that we've obviously lost a lot of staff. Just like other industries, we are currently facing a staffing crisis. And because of that, a lot of work that would be normally the responsibility of two teachers has fallen on only one teacher. So, I'm experiencing that. And because of that, I would say no, I don't get paid enough. Um, in addition to that, um, my annual review that I would normally receive a raise, really, I haven't seen that come in the last 2 years. We haven't been getting reviews like normal. I assume the funds aren't there. Um, I know that they're focusing heavily on getting fully staffed, and their resources have been going into training people who really honestly they quit after the first month or two, and then we're back in the same situation. So, although our enrollment has been as high as ever, um no, the workload is really really hard and heavy, and the pay has pretty much remained the same. I don't feel like I got paid well enough to begin with. I'm someone who holds a master's degree and has over 5 years of experience, and I make next to nothing. And that would even be the case if I worked for the public school. I can't imagine the stress load that those teachers are feeling. I can imagine that it's definitely probably worse than what I'm facing at the moment. Um, but to answer your question, no, I don't get paid enough, and I am financially impacted in that I have to do the work of two people for the price of one.
Okay, so how has the pandemic affected your outlook on the education field as a whole?
I believe that the pandemic has definitely exposed the weak areas, areas that we can improve. And I've begun to see the teachers that have remained in the field begin to speak up about the low wages, the high workloads, and it's no longer stigmatized anymore for teachers to talk about the concerns. Before, it's always been, oh, we do it for the students, we don't do it for the money. And that's been the narrative that's been pushed from teachers and administration. and parents and everybody in the community. But I think we're beginning to see a shift in that mentality. And it's beginning to look deeper into the problems as we're looking deeper into the problems in other industries, such as the food industry and, you know, services and different things like that. We're looking also into education, and we're seeing that teachers aren't paid enough. They aren't treated well. There's expected a lot of them, and we absolutely need them. I think long term, the pandemic will probably have a positive impact on the way that teachers are treated and the way that we respond to them. Hopefully, we'll begin to see raises in compensation along with other incentives to be a teacher. We need teachers, and I think the pandemic really has brought that to light.